Sir Walter Raleigh, explorer, poet, soldier, and once the favoured courtier of a queen, met his end beneath the executioner's blade, with a final sharp remark, "Yet the true cruelty lay not in the axe's swing, but in the 13 agonizing years that preceded it." His death, carried out on October 29, 1618, was less a single moment of justice and more a prolonged political execution, orchestrated by a paranoid king, driven by foreign influence, and ultimately marked by the blood of Raleigh's own son. What began with Queen Elizabeth's last breath ended with her most celebrated courtier walking to his fate at Westminster, where the crowd witnessed England's most famous man condemned not for crime but for power, punished because the new king feared his shadow more than he valued his service. This account, drawn from trial transcripts, diplomatic dispatches, and historian Mark Nichols' 2018 biography, reveals a chilling lesson in politics, justice, and betrayal. Life, legend, and eyewitness accounts from John Chamberlain and Dudley Carleton bring us to the beginning of Raleigh's downfall. On March 24, 1603, Queen Elizabeth I died, ending more than 40 years of rule during which Raleigh had been her man, commander, poet, adventurer, and courtier. He held monopolies over wine, cloth, and tin, served as captain of the Queen's Guard, warden of the Stannaries, and governor of Jersey, and lived lavishly in Durham House on the Strand. Wealthy, brilliant, and arrogant, he had also accumulated enemies, chief among them the sharp-witted, hunchbacked Robert Cecil, who had long waited for this moment. The new monarch, James VI of Scotland, now James V of England, arrived in London, a man very unlike Elizabeth, scholarly yet insecure, obsessed with plots and desperate for peace with Spain. Raleigh embodied everything James distrusted: swaggering, popular, anti-Spanish, and tied to the old Queen's court. Within weeks, James struck, stripping him of the captaincy of the Guard in May 1603, seizing his wine monopoly soon after, and finally confiscating Durham House to give to a bishop. Suddenly, the Queen's favourite was homeless, jobless, and cast aside. Yet Cecil sought not just to diminish Raleigh, but to destroy him, and the weapon would be a flimsy accusation: the so-called main plot. According to the charge, Raleigh and his ally Lord Cobham conspired to overthrow James and place Lady Arbella Stuart on the throne, backed by Spanish gold in exchange for toleration of English Catholics. The star witness was Cobham himself, a weak and frightened man, interrogated without counsel and pressured into signing a confession that directly named Raleigh. And that was all they had: the word of one terrified man imprisoned in the Tower. Soon enough, Cobham retracted the entire story, but it was too late. On November 17, 1603, Raleigh's trial was moved from plague-stricken London to Winchester, where the great hall of the castle filled with eager spectators. There, before a commission of judges, a jury already primed to convict, and a prosecutor who despised him, Raleigh faced what could only be described as a legal farce. The prosecutor, Attorney General Edward Coke, brilliant but cruel, relished turning trials into blood sport. By law, Raleigh was forbidden counsel, denied the right to call witnesses, and, most damningly, barred from confronting his accuser. Time and again, he begged, "Bring my accuser into this court. Let him stand before me and speak." The judges refused. Instead, Coke unleashed his fury, calling Raleigh a monster with the face of an Englishman, but the heart of a Spaniard, denouncing him as the most vile and execrable traitor that ever lived. Calm, eloquent, and unshaken, Raleigh defended himself with astonishing skill, dismantling the one piece of so-called evidence: Cobham's shaky, retracted confession. He exposed its absurdities and contradictions, reminding the court that Cobham had even smuggled out a letter clearing him completely. Raleigh's protest rang through the hall: "I protest before God and his angels, I never had any talk with you of treason." Coke countered with yet another statement from Cobham, conveniently reaffirming the accusation, almost certainly extracted under renewed pressure. The entire case rested on scraps of paper from a man who was not even present. For hours, Raleigh argued, his logic sharp and his words compelling, gradually transforming the mood of the crowd from contempt to admiration. By the end, he had won the spectators, But it made no difference. The verdict had been decided long before he entered the hall. The jury took just 15 minutes to return its verdict. Guilty. The Lord Chief Justice pronounced the full and gruesome penalty for treason. Raleigh was to be hanged, cut down alive, disemboweled, his entrails and genitals burned before his eyes, then beheaded and quartered, with the pieces displayed at the king's pleasure. The hero of Cadiz and once favoured courtier of Elizabeth listened in silence, yet King James hesitated, wary of executing the last great Elizabethan, still admired by the people, on such flimsy evidence. Days before the axe was to fall, Raleigh's sentence was suspended, not overturned, but delayed, and he was sent to the Tower of London to wait. He was 51 years old, and he would wait there for the next 13 years. His confinement was not a dungeon's misery. He had chambers befitting his rank, and for a time his wife Bess and their son Wat lived with him, with another son, Cairo, even born there in 16. Surrounded by books and visitors, with a small furnace shed for chemical and alchemical experiments, Raleigh turned his prison into a study. He brewed cordials, distilled spirits, and undertook his greatest project, the history of the world, an immense work tracing history from creation to his own time. Published in 1614, it became both a monumental achievement and a veiled critique of monarchy, drawing parallels between ancient tyrants and James's court. Furious, the king tried to suppress it, but the book was a sensation. From his cell, Raleigh remained a ghost of a prouder age, a voice of influence. Yet 13 years is a long time. His health declined, his wealth vanished, and his estates were granted to the king's favourites. Old, weakened and eclipsed by a new generation, Raleigh yearned for escape and clung to one last desperate card, the legend of a city of gold, El Dorado. For years, Raleigh had been haunted by the dream of El Dorado, a city of gold, said to lie hidden deep within the jungles of Guyana. He had chased the vision once before, in 1595, leading an expedition up the Orinoco River, convinced unimaginable riches awaited in the South American interior. But he returned with only stories, no treasure. Now in his 60s, after 13 long years in the Tower, Raleigh made one final gamble. He promised King James that he could locate a specific gold mine in Guyana, bring back immense wealth and restore England's depleted treasury. Best of all, he swore he could achieve it without provoking Spain, who claimed all of South America as their domain. James, desperate and cash-strapped, was tempted, yet wary, for peace with Spain hung by a thread. The Spanish ambassador in London, the cunning Count of Gondomar, whispered constantly in the king's ear, warning that Raleigh was a pirate, a heretic, and a man of blood. James agreed to a compromise that was, in truth, a carefully laid trap. Raleigh would be released to lead his expedition, but under impossible conditions. He was forbidden, on pain of death, from harming any Spanish subject, and crucially, his old death sentence of 1603 was never revoked. If he failed, or if he provoked Spain in the slightest, the king could simply revive it. To ensure disaster, James even revealed Raleigh's route and the size of his fleet to Gondomar, who swiftly sent word ahead to the Spanish colonies. Raleigh knew the truth. He was sailing straight into an ambush. Everyone knew the voyage was doomed, but it was Raleigh's final chance. In June 1617, at the age of 65, he set sail from Plymouth with a fleet of 14 ships, frail and worn from age and years of confinement. Disaster struck almost at once. Violent storms scattered the fleet, and disease swept through the crews, killing dozens, including Raleigh's second-in-command. By the time they reached the South American coast, the expedition was already broken. Raleigh himself, racked with fever, was too weak to stand. Unable to lead the march inland, he remained at the river's mouth with the main fleet and entrusted the mission to his loyal captain, Lawrence Keymis, sending with him his 23-year-old son, Wat. His instructions were desperate but unambiguous. Avoid conflict with the Spanish at all costs. Keymis set off with 5 ships and 400 men, forcing their way up the treacherous bends of the Orinoco. But instead of gold, they found a fortified Spanish outpost, Santa Tomé de Guayana, built specifically to block access to the interior. The Spanish had been warned and were ready. On the night of January 2, 1618, the English landed, and a savage battle erupted in the dark. No one knows who fired first, but the outcome was carnage. In the chaos, young Walter Raleigh was struck down and killed instantly. Though the English seized the town, there was no gold, no mine, no riches, only emptiness. For 3 fruitless weeks, Keymis searched the jungle, but the fabled mine was either a myth or forever out of reach. He had failed, and worse, he had broken the king's one inviolable command. By attacking the Spanish, the expedition had crossed the forbidden line. When Keymis returned with the news, Raleigh was shattered. His son was dead, the mission a ruin, and the shadow of the scaffold now inescapable. Grief soon hardened into fury, and Raleigh turned on Keymis, his voice raw with pain. "You have undone me, you have cost me my son and my fortune." Keymis, crushed beneath guilt, tried to explain, to plead for understanding, but Raleigh would not hear him. He swore he would never defend him back in England. Broken beyond repair, Keymis returned to his cabin, placed a pistol to his chest, and fired. The shot splintered a rib, but did not kill him. Still alive, he seized a knife and drove it into his heart. With their leader's despair and their captain's suicide, the expedition crumbled into mutiny. Some of the crews clamored to turn pirate, to salvage their ruin by seizing Spanish treasure ships, but Raleigh, now only the ghost of a commander, forced what remained of his men back onto their ships. There was no choice but to sail home. He knew precisely what awaited him in England. Gondomar was already demanding his head, and King James had branded him a pirate, issuing a warrant for his arrest. In June 1618, Raleigh's battered ship limped into Plymouth. For a fleeting moment, he tried to escape into exile in France, but betrayal came from within his own blood. His cousin, Sir Lewis Stukely, accepted a bribe and delivered him to the crown. Once more, Raleigh was seized and returned to the Tower. The trap laid 15 years earlier had at last snapped shut. There would be no trial for piracy, no inquiry into Guyana, for such proceedings were too dangerous. Evidence might have shown the Spanish fired first, or even hinted that James himself had quietly sanctioned a more aggressive mission. Safer for the crown to resurrect the old verdict. Raleigh would not be judged for his failed expedition, nor even for the death of his son in the Orinoco, but for treason, as decreed back in 16. Instead of answering for Guyana, Raleigh would face the ghost of the main plot, the discredited conspiracy from 1603. On October 22, 1618, a commission ruled that since he had broken the terms of his release, the old death sentence for treason must be carried out. A week later, on October 28, he was moved from the Tower to the Gatehouse prison at Westminster Abbey to spend his final night alive. There he penned a last heartbreaking letter to his wife, Bess. "My love, I send you that when I am dead, you may keep it, my advice that you may remember it when I am gone. I would not with my will present you with sorrows, dear Bess. Let them go with me to the grave and be buried in the dust." The next morning he ate a hearty breakfast, smoked one last pipe of tobacco, the very plant he had helped make fashionable in England, and prepared himself for death. On October 29, 1618, a scaffold stood in the yard outside Westminster Hall. The day was cold and damp, and a great crowd had gathered. At 66, Raleigh walked out with firm steps, dressed in a black satin doublet, a black taffeta waistcoat, and a fine ruff. One observer remarked that he looked as though he were going to a wedding. Granted the right to speak, he addressed the crowd for nearly an hour. His fevered body weakened, but his voice still steady. Calmly, he refuted the old charges of treason, explained the truth of the Guyana expedition, mourned his son, and affirmed his loyalty to England and the king. When he had finished, he gave away his hat and a silver watch. At last the executioner approached, kneeling to ask his forgiveness, as custom demanded. Raleigh placed a hand on the executioner's shoulder, smiled, and forgave him. Then he asked to see the axe, ran his thumb along its edge, and remarked with calm irony, "This is a sharp medicine. but it is a physician for all diseases and miseries. Kneeling, he laid his head upon the block and gave the signal. The executioner hesitated, unnerved by the man before him, until Raleigh urged him on. "What do you fear? Strike, man, strike." The axe fell, but the first blow was clumsy, not clean, and a groan of horror rippled through the crowd. A second stroke severed his head. The hangman lifted it high, declaring, "Behold the head of a traitor." Yet the people stood in silence, for they knew they had not seen justice, but the state-sanctioned murder of one of England's greatest men. The brutality of Raleigh's death lay not only in the 2 strokes of the axe, but in the 13 wasted years of captivity. The humiliation, the trap of a doomed expedition that claimed his son, and the cynical revival of a 15-year-old lie to justify his killing. History, however, left one chilling epilogue. King James permitted Raleigh's body to be buried the same day in St. Margaret's Church, Westminster, but his head was not laid to rest with him. At Raleigh's own request, it was embalmed and given to his wife, Bess, who kept it in a red velvet bag, carrying with her the severed memory of England's last great Elizabethan. For the next 29 years, until the day she died, Bess Raleigh kept her husband's embalmed head with her, the last silent witness to a king's betrayal. After her death, it passed to their surviving son, Carew, and was finally buried with him when he too was laid to rest. The state had claimed Raleigh's life, but his family preserved his memory. Why was he killed? Not for piracy, not for Guyana, not even for the alleged main plot. His death was a sacrifice to politics. King James wanted peace with Spain at any cost, and Gondomar, Spain's ambassador, demanded Raleigh's blood. James gave it to him. By reviving a verdict 15 years old, the king avoided a messy trial, avoided the truth, and handed Spain the head it sought. This was not justice. It was convenience. For the people of England, Raleigh's execution was more than the loss of a man. It marked the death of an era. The last great Elizabethan was struck down by a king who mistrusted his glory, envied his popularity, and feared his defiance. Raleigh had been soldier, sailor, poet, scientist, and historian. He had fought Spain, dreamed of empires, experimented with alchemy, and from a prison cell had written a history of the world. He embodied the ambition, brilliance, and arrogance of Elizabeth's reign. On the scaffold he faced death with wit and dignity, and in the stunned silence that followed the fall of the axe, all knew they had not witnessed the death of a traitor, but the political murder of one of England's greatest men. Raleigh's story has been told and retold for centuries, sometimes as that of a patriot, sometimes a pirate, sometimes a traitor. Yet his true legacy lies in the contradictions: brilliant and flawed, loyal and reckless, visionary and arrogant. He died not for gold or for treason, but as a victim of politics, caught between a king desperate for peace and an empire eager for vengeance. And yet his writings, his ventures, and his legend endured long after the men who condemned him were gone. His history of the world survived attempts at suppression. His poetry is still read. His name remains inseparable from England's memory of ambition and adventure. Even his final words, "Strike, man, strike," echo down the centuries. Raleigh's execution was never simply punishment. It was performance, a calculated show of royal power staged for a crowd. But the performance backfired. Instead of erasing him, it immortalized him. The axe fell, the crowd stayed silent, and in that silence, Sir Walter Raleigh lived on, an icon, a ghost, a reminder of how far kings will go to protect their crowns. In the end, his search for gold cost him everything: his freedom, his fortune, his son, and finally his life. Yet his legend remains, gleaming brighter than the El Dorado he never found.